Welcome to the Liberty Insider. This is the program that brings you news, views, updates, and analysis of religious liberty in the US and around the world. My name is Lincoln Steed, editor of Liberty magazine, and my guest on the program, Greg Hamilton, president of the Northwest Religious Liberty Association, and a previous guest, and one of the least talkative people I've ever had.
Son of Thunder.
Yeah. No, this program is premised on lots of dialogue. And let's talk about something that I think many people have heard talk of, peaceful coexistence. We want that, we don't want war, but when we talk about religious liberty, what is that often a stand-in for?
Well, the doctrine of peaceful coexistence comes from the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, which is 57 Muslim nations who believe that the only way we're going to have world peace is for there to be peaceful coexistence. That is, you have the right to peacefully coexist with your faith, but you don't have a right to evangelize someone else. Okay? Mm-hmm. That has gained a lot of traction. The previous Pope Benedict XVI, was very much against that doctrine, fought it. In fact, that doctrine has been very alive going clear back to Pope Paul VI. It's been growing in the interfaith community for many years. And it's gaining more credibility among world leaders, especially our last president, Barack Obama. And the problem with that is this Pope, Pope Francis I, is very much in tune with that sort of thinking and very much believes that the doctrine of peaceful coexistence is the only way we're going to get to world peace. But what that means is the suppression of religious freedom and in the end, really, the suppression of evangelism as we know it.
Well, that's what I was about to say. This is an anti-evangelism mindset.
Yes.
Because it presumes that each religious reservation is a self-contained community and you protect it. And you don't try and steal from anyone else. In the mission field, when I was a young person, they were the biggest fights in the South Pacific. Yeah. One mission would actually sometimes come violently against the other because they'd stolen some of their members.
I'm very much attuned to the interfaith movements as well as the Christian right with their their ecumenical movement. You know, I understand. I mean, I'm not wedded to their movements. I'm just saying I understand their reasonings for their movements, and they're not exactly opposed to one another. But the right wing basically says no, we must preserve the right of all peoples to free speech and freedom of religion. So they very much more adhere to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and Article 18 and 19 to respect religious freedom and free speech. But the interfaith movement, they want to put blasphemy law language in Articles 18 and 19 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which would basically say, hey, you have a right to peacefully coexist with your religion, but you don't have a right to evangelize somebody else.
Or even to make comments on someone else's religion.
And let's say you were to put all the religious leaders in the world in one great big room, right? And let's say you're the one who raised your hand and said, I would like to share my faith. And the way it works is this, in the interfaith community, that if one person, if everybody in the room agrees that you can share your faith, but one says, no, I don't agree, then you can't share your faith. Yeah. It becomes what's called collective censorship, right, which is oppressive by nature. And it actually comes from it comes from the Indonesian model, and that's where most of Muslims live, is in Indonesia, and it comes from their constitutional system in Indonesia called Pancasila. It's a 5-point doctrine, but it basically is summarized by the doctrine of peaceful coexistence. That is, you have a right to peacefully coexist, but you don't have a right to evangelize another. And this was their attempt.
It comes from the Quran.
This was their attempt for Islam to embrace democratization, all right? So there's been this wedding between democratization and the interfaith movement that suggests that the only way to world peace is this doctrine of peaceful coexistence. Now, I know that we have emphasized that in a goodwill nature as a church, that yes, we want peaceful coexistence as well. But as I was talking to Ted Wilson the other day, the General Conference President
of the Seventh-day Adventist Church.
Of the Seventh-day Adventist Church, after a banquet in Hollywood, Florida, near Fort Lauderdale at our 8th World Congress on Religious Freedom and Human Rights, he says, yeah, we know, we're for goodwill and hopefully, peaceful coexistence in the world, but in the end, we know it's not achievable. We know it's not possible. We know that the Lord's coming, and we know there's going to be all-out wars and Armageddon and everything else. There's going to be complete chaos on this earth. So we know that that's not going to happen, no matter how men strive to make that happen.
But was he comfortable with the peaceful coexistence?
He listened to me, and he was quite amazed.
I think
at what the agenda was.
Regardless of what he or any other official within our church or movement may say, I think Adventism, like many other evangelical or evangelistically inclined religions or movements are concerned, we have to keep reaching out and testing. But we know that we're fighting the trend, like in Russia at the moment. In the name of anti-terrorism, they're clamping down on religions, reaching out and publicly trying to persuade others.
Well, not only...
And you can easily be portrayed, as the Pope in his speech to Congress said, as an extremist or a fundamentalist if you have this aggressive approach. It's an aggression they don't like, an aggressive approach toward other peoples of other faiths.
Well, Pope Francis recently made an agreement with Archbishop Kirill of Russia, the Russian Orthodox head of the Russian Orthodox Church, and the agreement was finally, after many years of the Catholic Church saying, no, we will not agree to not evangelize in your country, we will not abide by that. Pope Francis has sacrificed that element. In fact, it's preparing a way for a state visit to Russia by Pope Francis I, because he agreed that the Catholic Church is not into evangelizing the Russian Orthodox Church, okay, to gain adherents from their church, or the old-fashioned term, sheep stealing, okay? So they've made that agreement, that pact recently, and they did that in Cuba together, of all places, Guantanamo Bay, to bring that about. That was a year and a half ago, all right? And so that's interesting. Not only that, but Pope Francis has also made a sacrifice compromise, so to speak, with the Catholic Church's traditional position in China.
I was about to mention that.
Regarding the appointment of bishops and cardinals in China. And so the Chinese government has always insisted they appoint their own.
Well, not insisted, they've done it.
They've done it.
And there's been a standoff.
And the Holy See, the Vatican, has said, no way. We resist that. We appoint our own. That are not recognized by the Chinese government. But now Pope Francis has come along. It was just about 4 weeks ago that he said no. In fact, I was at the Council on Foreign Relations at my annual Religion and Foreign Policy workshop last summer, and this was brought forward. This announced by Richard Haass, the president of the Council on Foreign Relations, that puts out the Foreign Affairs Journal. And he appears often on Fareed Zakaria's GPS on CNN on Sunday mornings. And he said that there's been a rapprochement made in which Pope Francis I has said to the Chinese government, yes, we approve of you going forward and
choosing the bishops.
Choosing the bishops. And so what's happened is this has prepared the way for a state visit by the Pope to China, the first time. So we're seeing a lot of movements take place that a lot of people aren't watching right now. And it is true that Pope Francis is facing a lot of opposition from Catholic conservatives. Even some liberals are getting on his case regarding his lack of the way he's handled the pedophilia and sex abuse cases among the priesthood and bishops and so on. So he's under a lot of fire right now. But when he makes these state visits to China and Russia, all of a sudden the fire is going to be gone. It's going to prolong his papacy.
Yes, absolutely. And you could see it as compromise, but you could also see it as a victory of sorts, that they've now ensconced themselves with the state. They're partners.
Yes, exactly. And that's exactly what Rome wants. And this Pope is pretty savvy. I mean, he's, in terms of understanding politics, he's one of the most politically savvy popes. In fact, if not the most politically savvy pope in history.
Yes, I think so.
And so a lot of people don't understand that dynamic regarding the Roman Catholic Church and what's happening now prophetically.
Well, he's focusing in on power, not doctrine.
I think of...
Would you agree with that?
Yes,
There'd be more
agree.
doctrinaire in the past,
Yes.
even though they wanted the power. But he's doctrine takes second. Remember, he's made any number of comments about divorce and gays, and no surprise that he's soft on the pedophilia, because very easy statements on the gay movement.
It fulfills the image of Revelation 17, where the woman, that is the false church, is riding the beast representing the state. Yeah. And it's a vivid image, in my opinion.
Yes. So where's this going? You started with something that's been troubling to me, a coalition of Islamic states, really to head off any need to interact with Christianity, have advanced this idea that if you almost say anything about Islam or the Prophet, you'll be accused of blasphemy.
Well,
and that early on when that first came, most people sort of saw it for what it was, but it's gaining some traction now.
They failed at the United Nations finally. Resolution 1618 was put together cobbled together by, with help from the Turkish government. It was put forward by Hillary Clinton, then Secretary of State, and what it said basically was that Muslims and all people of different people of faith or secularists would not condemn Christianity or deface crucifixes or any images of Christ. At the same time, they would not do the same towards Muhammad or mock Muhammad and that sort of thing. So that was actually an international resolution, 1618, that was decided to avoid, and that was brought about to avoid the attempt by the Organization of Islamic Cooperation, those 57 Muslim nations, to amend Articles 18 and 19, the religious freedom and free speech clauses of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, to basically amend it to put forward anti-blasphemy law language, which would have made punishable, or at least allowed any nation to punish by law any attempt to evangelize another or proselytize another person.
But it's a straw man argument in a way, very much like the free speech things, where religious freedom is like free speech. It's only really proven when you allow, under those rights, something that people find insulting and troubling. I wouldn't think it's a good thing to malign the Prophet Muhammad or Jesus. I mean, that's just rude, crude, and abusive. But you have to allow it if you've got religious freedom. To say it has to be below some threshold, people define thresholds differently.
Right.
And even as you're talking about this, it struck me, it never hit me before. Islam can, or Islamic countries, where there's really not a separation of church and state anyhow, can project this view internationally, but within their own countries, there's massive war between Shiites and Sunnis and Sufis and all the rest, where horrible abuses are heaped on people that differ slightly within their own religion.
But what seems to be converging, and a lot of people seem to be missing, is the fact that the secular world likes this whole idea of doctrine of peaceful coexistence. Because what it does is, you see, in their left-leaning utopian mindset, they believe that, that seems like a model that we can live with in terms of world peace.
You can believe what you want, just don't let me hear about it.
Exactly.
Stay in your corner.
Yeah, and I think that's what we're looking at. We're seeing more and more of a convergence of thinking in this regard, that if this means that it can create world peace, we're all for it.
Yeah, well, called syncretism on one level, isn't it?
Yeah, it is.
So, we'll be back after a short break. Stay with us and we'll continue this discussion. Welcome back to the Liberty Insider. Before the break with Greg Hamilton, we were talking about peaceful coexistence and probably saying things anything but peaceful to those that want such a thing. Let me tell you one thing that comes to mind when you start on this topic. Years ago at one of our international conferences, you mentioned one in Fort Lauderdale, we had one in Cape Town, and I sat down with a mullah from Iran.
I was there. Yeah, I remember that.
And I interviewed him.
I watched that interview.
And I never got enough out of it to use, but at one point he got impatient and he says, if you had been born in Iran, what would you have been born? And I said, I'd probably been born a Muslim. Fine. He says, and if I'd been born in America, what would I have been? Probably Christian. And he says, fine, let's just leave it that way.
Well, you know, there's something,
There's a half-truth in it as far as the likelihood.
But that really expresses best the whole doctrine of peaceful coexistence.
Yes, I thought it was.
And you summarized it well, yes. And that's an interesting dynamic that you bring up Iran, because Iran seems to be under a lot of fire right now. It seems like the people are becoming and demanding more democratic representation, true representation, and having a system that's not ruled by the mullahs or everything vetoed by the mullahs, whatever the people want.
Well, you're leading into my preoccupation with Iran, because I don't think it's a fundamentalist country. It's been hijacked by fundamentalist imams. It's a very urbane, Western-leaning society.
Yes, it is.
And left to its own devices, I think it'll revert.
And I think for any idea for any of our leadership in the United States to want to bomb Iran and bomb civilians and to bomb, I just think it's really not the way to go.
And the U.S. has discovered a little bit of this world after 9/11, but I still don't think we quite know what's going on. Like fairly recently, within several months, Saudi Arabia, I think it was the foreign minister of Saudi Arabia, threatened to attack Iran with nuclear weapons.
Oh yeah, I know.
So the hatred between elements, they're politically different identities, but they're really champions of the two factions, major factions in Islam. They're ready to kill each other. So it isn't just Islam troubling Christianity or Christian nations.
No, there's a lot of factions within Islam.
And we can play into this sort of stuff. But I believe with Iran, to my dying day, I've been there back before when the Shah was there. It is not, it's not like Pakistan, which is easily mobilized to fanaticism.
But that desire that you just mentioned, that desire for peaceful coexistence, this realization that you have a right to be who you are and I have a right to be who I am, sounds good. And
it's a half truth.
In a way, it is good. Yeah. But where does it lead?
Yeah.
And I think in terms of world peace, I'm all for world peace. But if it means world peace and we compromise by sacrificing true religious freedom, where does that take us? And
it also, apart from my ability or right to talk, it means that the other side is closing their ears. What was it, Felix? One of the interlocutors of Paul says, I might call you another time, leave me alone now.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, we don't want to encourage that view. It comes naturally enough to people anyhow. If you're wanting to spread a truth, in our case, the gospel truth, you want people to at least be ready to hear.
Yeah.
I know the prophecy at the end of time is that they won't endure sound doctrine. They've got itching ears, which means that most times they want to block their hearing.
But this seems to be gaining steam all around the world. I remember when George W. Bush was president, the Secretary of State, including under Clinton, Madeleine Albright, and then Colin Powell and Condoleezza Rice and Hillary Clinton and onward, you have this movement that puts forward and promotes and champions this interfaith concept of the doctrine of peaceful coexistence as the path towards world peace. Even Madeleine Albright wrote a whole book on it. And John Kerry, when he was Secretary of State, decried all the nations that seemed to be adopting these blasphemy laws, yet at the same time was promoting the interfaith culture as a means, as a mediary to bring about world peace. So he was full of contradictions. So I find it interesting because more and more you see the Saudi government, you see other governments in the Middle East saying, yeah, if we just follow this doctrine of peaceful coexistence, we'll be all right. And the other nation that's buying into it is Israel. I don't know if you've noticed that Israel and Saudi Arabia are finding common cause.
Well, they have for quite a long time. Yeah.
Yes, they have. And so,
of course, Egypt after the treaty particularly, but yes.
Well, even after Israel bombed Gaza into the sand in the Christmas of 2008, Saudi Arabia applauded it.
Part of what's going on is, it's a term no one uses anymore, but realpolitik.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
And that can sometimes supersede religious ideology. But I still believe that if you think from a religious point of view, it explains a lot of what's happening in the world today and yesterday, more than people imagine. But most history books just dismiss religion.
But if you notice the Israeli government, even in Israel, if you try to proselytize these days.
Well, it's a socialist secular government. And we're back to our separation of church and state.
They frown heavily on any form of proselytization in Israel while you're there.
Right.
And they too have bought into this interfaith doctrine of peaceful coexistence. And for me, I think it's problematic. Oh, you say it keeps the peace, it keeps the status quo. That sounds good. You have a right to meet in your congregation, your church, your school, your home, but you don't have a right to beat someone over the head with the Bible or give them a doctrinal study, lest you be prosecuted or put in prison.
Now, I'm trying to think how this relates, and maybe I'm shifting gears slightly, but that's fine. Got a few minutes left. I just finished reading a very thought-provoking article on what's troubled people for a generation now, the demographic remaking of Europe. And there's strong political movements in most European countries, nativist movements, very much like the nativist one that just took power here.
Yes.
To restrict...
Like Brexit.
Yes, to limit immigration. Now, on the face of it, you can say this is prejudicial and all the rest, but there's a real demographic challenge playing out in Europe and in the US, but not as easily perceived. What's really brought it to a head has in particular been immigrants from Islamic countries whose culture and religion are inseparable and unchangeable. Mm-hmm. And I haven't seen any discussion or heard anyone say anything that has an answer to that, because it's just obvious that at some point when the demographics pass a crucial point, the culture and the religion will have changed. Yeah. And so it is a real threat.
Well, I wouldn't see it as a threat. I mean...
Well, it's a threat to the old order, to whatever... And one case I was reading was one of these French nationalists. Actually, I wish I could remember the guy's name. His books are well read and unfortunately have been the tutorials for even the alt-right and all the other nativist...
So what you're saying is that democratic constitutional systems in Europe and these European countries would not be able to withstand people who come in who want to radically change the current order.
Right, both religious and social, but mostly because it's a religion that has its social and political structure built in.
So you don't think their constitutional systems would be strong enough to withstand that?
No, not if that group became a certain critical mass of society, because they will refuse to change.
So would you say that would be a problem here in the United States as well?
It'll be a problem anywhere. I mean, it's not a problem if it goes unchecked and the shift takes place, but if you're wanting to assert an identity you have now and to protect it against a new and unknown identity, then you have a serious problem.
So, there's a concept known as Dar al-Islam, which Islam, what they mean by that is
society.
All the world is Allah's, therefore it has to be conquered for Allah. And so I understand that, but to me, the whole interfaith concept of the doctrine of peaceful coexistence, doesn't that put a check on that? In other words, because they want to proselytize.
Well, I think that now you're reaching ahead to where I'm thinking. I think that's what they imagine. Okay. But it won't work.
Because Islam does not proselytize by evangelization. They grow by birth rate. Okay. Right, so they come into a country and they grow by birth rate.
So,
but that hasn't overtaken our country or even Europe.
When you freeze things by peaceful coexistence, then you have absolutely cast in iron this tendency for demographic overtake. Well, and everyone says that. Like, the pagan countries or the animist countries felt that Christianity was a threat. It is, but it isn't as an inflexible or a guaranteed a threat as a group that will not change, cannot change because it comes with them.
Professor Philip Jenkins, in his book, The Next Christendom from Baylor University, actually argues against that. And he says that Christianity is actually growing much faster than Islam is through birth rate. And everybody is alarmed about the birth rate of Islam and taking over the world, but actually the growth of Christianity in a Pentecostal way throughout the world is overtaking the world right now as we see it. More and more world leaders are looking to religious leaders to solve the problems of the world, especially world conflicts. And so this doctrine of peaceful coexistence is very attractive to them. Watch for that. It's a trend that is worthy of your attention.
Peaceful coexistence is in some ways the end of all things. The Bible says that one day the wolf will lie down with the lamb. But here on this earth, in this dispensation, the calls are rather disingenuous. We have the Pope of Rome saying the doctrine doesn't matter, let's join together. We have Islam, which elements of it which lie at the root of terrorism, saying, you know, don't insult us, we won't insult you. And you have others saying the doctrine is not important. I remember an Archbishop of Canterbury talking about coming together, put aside doctrine, but if not accepted, he says, we cut it off, we'll cut you off and destroy you. Peaceful coexistence is possible, but it's only possible in the context of respect and rights for others and letting others speak and witness as the Spirit compels them. For Liberty Insider, this is Lincoln Steed.